Welcome.
Thank you.
This is the clicker.
Thank you. So I have to say.
Oh, I've almost forgotten.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this is my one. We need to talk about this picture.
All right.
Yeah, because you took this picture with you. This is has a very special meaning for you.
Yeah, yeah.
So what is it about? Let's start with a guy next to you.
I don't know him.
You don't know him?
Yeah.
Really?
I just saw him at the top of the mountain.
Ah, you met him on the top of the okay.
So that's Tony, the CEO of ZAPPOS, one of my best friends and the co-founder of Delivering Happiness.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I'm actually going to talk about this during the presentation.
You're going to talk about the story,
yeah,
so you don't
yeah,
need.
yeah.
Okay,
so
well,
now you have
perfect.
a visual.
I have a visual. You'll talk about the story, so we'll
Yeah.
hear about it.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
wonderful.
I
Nou,
don't
dat lukt. Ja. Mijn werk zit erop.
I just wanted to hurry him off the stage. Pardon my Dutch, but goedemorgen. Yeah. That took me an hour to rehearse. But thank you so much for having me here. I love coming back to the Netherlands. I actually lived here a while back and just fell in love with the place. I feel like it's a second home. And throughout that whole time, though, I only picked up 3 more words. Dank u wel, alsjeblieft, and lekker ding. It worked out okay, so thank you for bringing your lekker ding selves here. So, here I'm talking about happiness, right? What a time to be alive in this week of happiness, in this world of happiness, but what does it really mean? So for me, I'm gonna talk about my background experience and hopefully how to actually explain this one equation. I've been consulting at ZAPPOS for many years when it was a startup back in the day, and then now it's Delivering Happiness, the CEO and co-founder with Tony Hsieh. And when I think about all my experience, it really comes back to one simple equation. If we can create environments where employees are happy first, that equals happier customers, and that actually equals It's actually a little. I hear it now.
That's the reason.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think he wants it for his own wardrobe. Okay, so this equation usually strikes people as pretty common sense. Happy employees, happy customers, more profitable, sustainable business, but actually also more meaningful lives. And when I say this, people usually nod their heads, yeah, that makes sense, but the biggest question now is how? How do you actually put this equation in place, but actually how do you sustain it over time? And that's, in the end, why we believe in culture as a competitive advantage for businesses today and in the future. So before I go further, I just want to take a quick poll. How many people in the audience know about ZAPPOS.com? Just out of curiosity? Wow. Awesome. And then how many people know about Delivering Happiness? It was a book that came out about 2010. Awesome. Very cool. Thank you. And then just a show of hands in the room. If you were to try and guess the percentage of people in the whole world, in the workforce, percentage of people that are unhappy at work on a day-to-day basis, raise your hand. 20%? 40? 60? 80? 90? Wow. We've got a big group of pessimistic people in this audience, but I'll get back to that in a little bit. And then just the last question for now. How many people, raise your hands, believe that you actually know how to sustain your own personal, meaningful happiness? Raise your hands. Well, I come to the right place. My job is done, I'm done. This is a very high average, but the reality is when I travel the world and I talk about this topic, strangely enough, only 1 to 5% of the room raises their hand. Actually, I was in China a few years ago, so I can officially say only 0 to 5% of the room raises their hand. And I have to wonder why, because I actually feel we're pretty lucky. We have all these technological advances, socioeconomic ones, but yet why are we fundamentally, as a global society, unhappy on an everyday, meaningful basis? Because I have to think about it, it's not a new concept by any means. There was a dude by the name of Aristotle back in 200 BC, and what he said is happiness is actually the purpose of our existence, but more importantly, what he said is happiness is dependent on ourselves. So if you think about this a little bit, before we go on, I want to bring up some real-world examples. We've got Renee in the top right-hand corner. She just got her financial statement from Merrill Lynch. Thought that she would be saving for her 401k to be a happy girl, unfortunately not. And then we've got Stella in the bottom right there. She's just unhappy because her mom won't upgrade her phone. But seriously, though, I want everyone in this room to think about this question. What is your personal goals in life? And what's interesting about this question is, no matter who you ask or how you answer, I want to be successful in business. I want to have a family. I want to be healthier. If you ask yourself why enough times, the interesting thing is it usually comes back to the one basic thing. I want to be happy, or I want to make sure the people in my life that I love are happy as well. So what's interesting, though, is that when we talk about scientific happiness and positive psychology, all the scientists are saying, yes, we are physically hardwired to seek this happiness as human beings, but we are fundamentally really, really bad at predicting the long-term state of our happiness. So they've done studies on lottery winners, and they would think, oh yeah, of course they'll be happy, but now we know lottery winners' happiness levels stay the same or actually peter down over time. But what's also interesting is that the inverse is true. What they did the studies on people that lost their sight or use of their limbs, and their happiness levels stay the same or actually increased over time. So this is all to say, as human beings, we are pretty bad at predicting what can sustain that happiness. So for me, I started reflecting on my own life because I find it so ironic that here I am passionate about this topic of happiness. Simply because when I was growing up, I was never that happy-go-lucky kid in school. I would be the one sitting in the back of the room with my Walkman on, listening to songs by The Cure and Depeche Mode. We've got some fans here, right? I'm not talking about the Pop 40 stuff, I mean the original nitty-gritty stuff. And I was reading books like The Stranger by Albert Camus, reading it in French, so you can't get much gloomier than that. So I was just asking all these existential questions, like what is this all for? Why am I even here? So for me, again, I started reflecting, and I reflected to my childhood. And so I'm Asian American, and my parents were immigrated from Hong Kong several decades ago. So for whatever reason in that household, I thought there were 3 quintessential ways to be successful in life. Number 1 was get into a good school. Number 2, become a doctor or a lawyer. And number 3, learn a variety of musical instruments. And so for me, I thought I was successful, at least in my parents' eyes, because I got into UC Berkeley in California. I was studying pre-med, and I had several years of piano under my belt. But when I started studying pre-med, I realized, this doesn't feel right to me. So I started wandering, and I stumbled upon something called Asian American Studies. It's actually a major at Cal in Berkeley. And I just felt so impassioned by this topic because I learned so much about myself, about my ancestors that I had no idea before then. So I got super excited, and I decided to major in it. And then I realized I had to tell my parents. So I picked up the phone. You can probably predict the next scene. They completely freaked out. They said, Asian American Studies? Why don't you just come home more often? We'll tell you what your Asian American Studies life is about. We are working all these jobs for you and your brothers, at giving you opportunities we never had. We, actually, your great-great-great-grandparents sailed the Pacific Ocean in a tiny little boat and almost died so that now you can tell us you're studying yourself. And I said, wow, they're really good at this guilt thing. But I stood my ground, and I did it. I majored in it, and I remember that moment. I graduated. I was in my apartment. I finally realized what my parents meant. I couldn't find a job. So it was my turn to freak out, and I just started cold calling every single company I knew, and it was really lucky for me. It was really about time and place. The internet was born in Silicon Valley, and I became an internet consultant at KPMG. And you know the story, .com boomed, the money title status literally fell in my lap the next day. You also know the end of that story, .com busted, and the money title status was gone. At that point, I felt like the most major loser. And it wasn't the fact that I got fired or laid off. It was the fact that I thought the money title status meant everything, yet I realized it didn't mean that much at all. And so at that moment, I realized also I was running away from this question, which was, what would I actually do with my life if I did not fear failure? So at that moment, it was a great way to segue Kilimanjaro, I decided to do something out of my comfort zone. I didn't know where I wanted to go, but I knew I didn't want to go back to where I was. So I decided to climb the mountain, and it was Kilimanjaro. And so I called up my buddy Tony. He had just become the CEO of ZAPPOS not too long before. And I said, "Do you want to do this with me?" And he's like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So if you can imagine, we're climbing this mountain, we're in our 20s. I just got laid off from my job. He just sold his first company to Microsoft for about $280 million. So clearly, we were at the opposite ends of the financial spectrum. But what was really interesting, and we didn't realize it until we worked on the book, is that we were actually thinking the same exact question, which was, what would we do with our lives if money didn't matter? So at that point, we actually summited. It was like straight out of a movie, Sunrise over the Serengeti. Both of us were thinking, wow, maybe anything can be possible. So at that point, we actually go back to our own lives. ZAPPOS was about to go bankrupt, but Tony decided to finance his own money into it, and the rest is history. I go back to my life, and that moment happens. And it happens to everyone in this room at least once, if not several times. It's that feeling when your life does a 180, or when the rug gets pulled up from under your feet. And for me, it was facing my greatest fear. And my greatest fear was losing someone in my life that I couldn't imagine life without. And that was my dad. I lost him to colon cancer. And again, it really thrust me to that point of asking questions like, what is this all for? So I decided just to look at life like a green field. I just started doing things that I was super passionate about, like writing and graphic design and making films, just things that I thought were substance and really me. And through that process, I realized if it wasn't the money, title, status, what was it? It was the people in my life that my values were about. Because I knew if I based my decisions on that, I would never look back with regret. So in a weird parallel way, that's when I stumbled upon ZAPPOS.com as a tiny little startup. And when it first started, all I wanted to do was sell the most shoes in the world. But then it grew up. And then they said, you know what, we want to be the best at customer service. But then they grew up again. And they said, you know what, we want to be the best at delivering happiness to our employees. So through that process, they realized their own higher purpose, which was delivering happiness to their employees and anywhere they go. So fast forward a few years later, that's when Tony and I worked on our book, Delivering Happiness. And I wanted to pause, actually, on this slide a little bit, because this is an exercise we do with all of our clients, and it's very simple and maybe something that could help you as well. It's called the Happiness Heartbeat exercise. And it's really simple. For what I did here was I just plotted my highs and lows in life, because our belief is that not just the highs that inform our sustainable happiness, our lows are just as informative as well. So if you think about at each of these plot points, what values were there or not there, what people were present or not present, then those answers actually start informing how do we actually sustain our own meaningful happiness in life. And what's great about this is that you can totally apply this to businesses. If you think about the ups and downs of your team or your business itself, what values were there or not there? What people were there or not there? And that actually, those answers start completing the sentence of how do I sustain my business? So, of course, I need to talk a little bit about my case study of ZAPPOS. This is a picture of ZAPPOS, but believe it or not, there's not a rainbow over every day. But when I think of ZAPPOS, I think of this quote by Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And I love this not just as a personal mantra, but I love it because companies like ZAPPOS actually use this for day-to-day business decisions. This is a picture of the warehouse in Kentucky. Some might think it's a woman's dream closet, and others might think it's a man's ultimate nightmare, except for Frank, of course. So there's been so much money and time and resources spent in this warehouse to make it one of the most efficient in the world. But they didn't do that to say, hey, look at our amazing technology. What they did that for is to create PECs with every employee they touch, every customer they touch. PEC is personal emotional connection. So that, as an example, if someone orders a pair of shoes in, let's say, New York, and puts their kids to bed before they go out to work the next day, open their door, and boom, there's a box of shoes at the doorstep. That's all to create that PEC, that wow. So thinking about ZAPPOS, though, a lot of people think that customer service is their number one priority. But the reality, though, internally, is that it's company culture. And the thought there is that if you get company culture right, everything else, like having amazing customer service, like having productive, engaged employees, actually come more naturally. So then begs the question, well, how do you make it a priority? And there's a few ways that I'll be explaining throughout the rest of the presentation, but for ZAPPOS, this is what they started. One of them was they paid employees to quit. So they have a training program, 5 weeks long, for every single person that comes in. And essentially they have a check as a standing offer to leave at any time, no questions asked. And why they do that is that because they really want people to say, honestly, whether or not this culture, these values, our higher purpose, do they align with yours? And when we first started doing this program, it started at $100, and then went to $200, and then $1,000, and now I think it's at $5,000 for anyone coming in. And the reason why they keep upping it is actually because not enough people are taking it. So if you think about the financials part of it, it actually saves them money in the long run because every bad or wrong fit, wrong hire, it costs companies 150 to 300% of that person's salary. So at the time we wrote the book, we actually estimated we had lost $100 million in bad, wrong hires. So that's one of the ways they do it. Another example was a ZAPPOS culture book. This is something that we started about 12, 13 years ago now. And it was just when we rolled out our values, and we started asking ourselves, well, how do we define culture? And we said, well, why don't we just ask the employees? So he said, can you please submit 2 to 3 paragraphs on what you think ZAPPOS culture means to you? And what we did was we published it in a physical book, but the key here is that we published it totally unedited, so that all the good stuff was in there, but also the bad stuff was in there. And it became a really transparent look, we started doing it year over year, to see whether or not, as the company grew and changed, did the culture stay intact or actually improve over time. So it was really interesting, because this was for internal use, but then we started sending it out to people that was just asking for it, and eventually around the world. And so even ZAPPOS not being able, or they don't ship outside of the US, we started getting fan mail from Japan or Brazil or just places around the world that had no idea what the customer service felt like, had no idea what the product felt like, but they just said they loved what ZAPPOS stood for. So it was really interesting. It became a brand book for them as well. And if you're interested in a copy, or I can send you a free PDF if you're interested in a sample of it, of a copy that we did for another client, feel free to either email me, and I'll have this at the end as well, or you can text Jenn at 38470. And again, I'll have this at the end as well. So that's the culture book. And now we talk about values. So when I was at KPMG as a consultant, I would see all these different environments and have all these fancy plaques on the wall, in the boardroom or the lunchroom, and saying, these are our values and this is our mission statement. But when I started walking around and talking to folks, sadly, most of them wouldn't even know what they were. So I think that's a big difference in the companies that we see now. It's ZAPPOS, this example. Every single person knows their values. And I believe they do that not because my boss told me to, because they actually believe in these values for themselves. In a weird way, there was a guy, he was writing in the culture book, and it really struck me because he said, I was going to a grocery store, and there's a gentleman in front of me, and he couldn't afford his groceries. And he said, I literally looked down at my shirt, it was a ZAPPOS shirt, and he said, I decided to live up to our values, and I paid for the guy's groceries. And it really struck me because that was the moment I realized we as companies, we as business leaders, have the ability not just to do good in the workplace. We have the ability to inspire people to do the right thing inside and outside of work. So these are their values. I won't name every single one, but one of them I love is create fun in a little weirdness. So there's actually an interview question that we have. On a scale of 1 to 10, how weird are you? So I love asking this question in live audience because those with those grins, ear to ear, I know you're at the 8, 9, 10 in that scale, which is cool because that's where I'm at too. But the whole point of that is that question is not the number that they answer with, it's how they respond to it. Are they going to be okay being true to their weird, authentic self at work? And more importantly, are they going to be okay with everyone else around them being true to their weird, authentic self as well? So to wrap up ZAPPOS, this is just one company that happened to focus on customer service and culture to become the several billion-dollar company it is today. And as some of you might know, they got acquired by Amazon several years ago for about $1.2 billion at the time of closing. But what's great about this is that it's not just ZAPPOS doing it. There's companies all over the world that realize the potential of people. And this graph is just a simple example to show. For those Fortune's best companies to work for, over the last 15 years, consistently have outperformed the S&P 500. And we all know how economically turbulent it's been. So this is all to say that if we as companies actually double down on our people, we will actually see that financial reward. But unfortunately, this is the case. Are you familiar with this movie, Office Space? So it's so interesting because now we know all those data points, but this is still what's happening, and not just in corporate America, all over the world. The question I asked earlier, what percentage of people are unhappy? 87% are disengaged from their everyday work, and that's costing, in the US alone, $500 billion loss in productivity. So then that's the question we ask ourselves, why, and what can we do about it? So what I believe is that we are going into this, what I'm calling the adaptive age. We've come from an agrarian society, we went to industrial society, and then we have technology, and now I feel like we're in the adaptive age. And what I mean by this is that the pace of change in the world is just blinding us so quickly we've never seen at this rate before. We've got the Internet of Everything, where our phone is connected to our laptop, connected to the chair you're sitting in, connected to our car. And so this is an amazing time to be alive. We're so connected in so many ways in almost this neural network around the world. Yet, this brings us as human beings a sense of complexity. And us as human beings are really begging for a sense of simplicity. And so that's why I feel like we're in adaptive age, because especially over the last several years when I've seen it delivering happiness, is that more and more people are coming out and saying, I want to be self-aware. I want to understand who I am, my weird authentic self, and my place in society, my place at work, my place in the greater scheme of things in the great world. And so that's what I think is most opportune at this time, in the sense of what happiness could mean, because with this adaptive age, I think it's important that we control and change what we can, but accept and embrace what we can't. And in that sense, how can that apply to workplaces? Which is why I love this quote by Mr. Darwin: if it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the smartest, it's actually those that are most responsive to change. So what's interesting is that we have all this change going on, yet our workplaces are still in the Stone Ages. We know a lot of industries that are still living off fax machines, and no matter where I am in the world, the number one issue, even though we have amazing like email, Slack, text, whatever, the number one issue is always communication. So how can we apply this amazing stuff we have around us and be able to come to work and feel that we can have an honest conversation with my coworker? So that's why I believe that it's not only time to think different. This is back in the 80s, it's actually time that we work different too. And so the question again comes to, what can we do about it on a day-to-day basis? And that's why I believe we need to not just make little adjustments, I really believe we need to reframe the way we work. So along the way, from ZAPPOS to DH, I boiled it down to 6 basic things. What did we learn? So number 1 was commitment. And this sounds the easiest, but it's actually the hardest thing to do. And the thought here is that we now know what culture isn't. It's not having free Red Bull in the fridge. It's not having a ping pong table in the rec room. It's something so much more dynamic and intricate for every single person coming in your door, every single person going out, changes the dynamic of that culture. Because what we believe is that culture goes hand in hand with strategy at the priority table. And once people think that they have a culture launched, and this is where a lot of things go wrong for even companies like Google, or even companies like ZAPPOS, if they're not committed to it, then it's going to go wayward. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to revisit your core values. And this one's a biggie because now most companies have core values, but when I talk to them, I would say 9 times out of 10, people aren't living by them. And so what we help companies do is actually define behaviors out of those values. So it becomes black and white as to whether or not a person is living up to those values. As an example, I don't know if you remember back in the day, the company called Enron, and one of their values was integrity. Case in point of they weren't really behaving by their values. Another thing that we talk about is understanding your own personal values and lining it up with your company's core values, and where do they align. And that's really important because, again, it's about living not for your boss because your values are there. It's living for yourself. What is it within you that align with your company's core values? So this is DH's core values. I won't name every single one again, but number 9 is my favorite, one of my favorites. Do more with less. So basically, be like MacGyver and be like Bruce Lee. Be like MacGyver, creative, do more with less, do anything with a paperclip, and be like Bruce Lee, flow like water. And why I named this particular one is because I'm pretty sure no other company has it, and I'm pretty sure no employee will forget it. So the point being here, when you create your values, make sure it's aligned with your DNA of your company, your team, whatever that might be, so that it's not, again, just a meaningless word on the wall. Third thing we learn is commitment to transparency, and this one's pretty simple. It's just to be your true, authentic self. And what we believe is actually not about work-life balance. We actually believe in work-life integration. And the thought there is that because when we're working, most of our waking hours are in the workplace, so why wouldn't we want to integrate that together? How do you do things like that? We say, bring your passions to work, so that someone, let's say in the IT department, is talking about going camping with his family this weekend. And then someone overhears from customer service, says, oh, that sounds amazing. Can we join? Can my family join? So what happens is that they have this meaningful experience outside of work. But more importantly, what they do is they bring it back to work come Monday. So they're more communicative. They're more productive. They're more engaged with each other. Because at the end of the day, we don't work harder because we have a coworker. We work harder because they're our friend. So that's one form of transparency. Another is, again, communication is always the top issue. So how can we create transparent environments where people feel trusted and comfortable airing out things that when things go wrong? Because we realize and we know not every day of our work can be happy. So how can we support each other and realize that if someone's having a bad day, we call it positive tensions, how can you let them air it out? So what is that tension? So that in the end of the day, if you're bonded by your values, by your DNA, and everyone knows the direction you're headed, having these positive tensions are not a bad thing. It's just a part of general life. Fourth thing we learn is purpose, and this is very simple. What are we doing that's bigger than ourselves? How can we inspire everyone so that they're coming to work and feeling like it's not just a paycheck, it's not even just a career, it could be their calling. There's a classic story about JFK, one of our presidents, back in the day when the NASA program was just launched, and he's walking around the new building, and he saw a gentleman, he was sweeping the floor. And he asked him, what do you do here, sir? And the gentleman responded, he said, I'm putting a man on the moon. And something that's simple in this case, like no matter what you do in your everyday tasks, as menial as it could be, if we can align it to something greater than just yourself, what would that look like? So that's purpose. The fifth thing is building meaningful relationships, a huge one in scientific happiness. And what I think about this is, remember that concept of PEC, personal emotional connection? What if we extended not just to our customers, but to every person we touch, every company we touch in your ecosystem. So every partner, every vendor, and obviously your coworkers. Because this, now more than ever, I believe is that this is not a zero-sum game anymore. We can all come to the table and believe that we can all contribute and walk away benefiting that much more from it. So I love this quote by Mr. Simon Sinek. He said, when people are financially interested, or invested, they want to return, but when they're emotionally invested, they actually want to contribute. I'll pull another quote real quick from the book, actually. I'm wondering if anyone knows who said this. If the person you're talking to isn't listening, be patient. There may be a small piece of fluff in his ear. Does anyone know? One of our more prolific thinkers of all time? That was Winnie the Pooh. So last thing we learned, and this is a biggie, and we all know how hard it is, building the right team. So one of the lessons we learned was hire slow and fire quick. And I know that sounds really super harsh for a people-driven company, and I know it can be hard, and especially in different parts of the world. But the point is here, is that we all know that it just takes that one person to change the dynamic of everyone else's sort of experience and therefore happiness. So we have to ask ourselves, is that one person in that meeting room, in that department, in that company worth everyone else's expense of productivity and engagement and therefore happiness? And that's why it's so much more important to spend time to make sure you're hiring the right person to begin with. The second thing we learned was to hire and fire based on values. And so here, this is kind of a tricky one because this is saying if you even have an amazing salesperson, let's say, who's just nailing all the numbers, beating all the numbers, but that person isn't living to a value, like communicating with honesty and respect, as an example. So that, we believe, is actually a sound reason to actually have that person transition out. There's an article that I read in Wired magazine. And it was really interesting to me because it was about a bunch of scientists, that they wanted to understand the movement of wildlife in their natural habitats. So first they studied bees, and they looked at bees and they noticed, they're getting their job done, they're making their honey, but they're kind of chaotic, like just butting heads all the time. But then they looked at mackerel in the sea. And what they noticed there is when they felt threatened, they'll just swim faster and faster. And again, they were getting their job done, they were surviving. But they weren't really getting anywhere. But then they looked at birds. And then, if you can imagine, so birds over the Serengeti, let's say, they're all flying the same direction. One bird, random bird, changes direction, they all fly together. Same thing, another random bird flies this way, they all fly together. So what's interesting in that scenario is that they're all acting as individual animals, but as a unit, they're acting as one organism. So once they did all this research, they realized the movement of all these animals are actually to have the same algorithm, except for one variable. And that variable is what they called alignment. So in the end, the bees had the least to no alignment, whereas the birds had the most alignment. So if we think about this concept and how we can actually apply this to our companies, to our organizational settings, if we can basically create our teams to be able to have the same DNA, our culture, our values, our higher purpose, then each and every one of these team members can actually feel that they are able to make their own decisions, trusted by others, and they don't know what they're responsible for, all knowing, and this is all this interaction and relationship with each other, all knowing they're all flying towards the same goal. So those are our lessons learned, and I'm just gonna ask just what you think might be the most critical success or fail factor of those 6 things that I named. What would you guess? You could just yell it out. Core values, yeah. Relationships, yep. So I believe all those things are important, and over time, what I realized, the one thing, if this is not there, then everything else will eventually become obsolete, is actually commitment. And I was struck by that too, because at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that over just in the last year, or 2016, $1.5 billion were spent towards these culture programs. And of all those programs, a whopping 70% of those actually failed. And the reason being is because they invested all this money, but they failed to commit for the long term. Because at the end of the day, culture is just like happiness. It's a journey. We're always gonna have our ups and downs, which is totally fine, that's life. But we have to commit to the fact that it's for the long term. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the science of it and how we apply positive psychology along the way. So this is one framework that we have, and these are different levers, essentially, that we can apply to our lives. So number 1 is sense of control. Am I able to make decisions? Am I being trusted to make my own decisions and actually act upon them? Ritz-Carlton is known really famously for their customer service, and one of the things they do is they allow a budget I think it's a few $1,000s for every single employee, no matter if it's front desk or housekeeping, no matter who it is. And so that gives them a sense of control, that I'm trusted to use this money to wow a customer. An example of that is actually not too long ago, I was on a tour with Chase Bank, and I was staying at the Marriott, one of its brands, the Renaissance. And so every time I would come in, they had like a really cool cafe, very modern, and I'd come in and grab snacks, I'd get some coffee, and I'd bring it out to the cashier, and they'd said, "It's okay. No worries, you're fine." And I'm like, "Oh, that's cool." So next morning, I do the same thing, get some coffee, get some snacks, and they're like, "Oh, no, you're covered." And I'm like, wow. So of course, I do it 10 more times to see if it actually happens, and lo and behold, it does, because for them, they're giving their employees a sense of control, that they can wow their customers, because if we're gonna be loyal to them, well, they'll be loyal to us too. Sense of progress is the next one. Is like, basically, am I growing? Am I developing? And one of the things that we see that more companies are doing, which is essentially understanding what your skills are. So StrengthsFinder, StrengthScope, there's a lot of tools out there, but aside from what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, what else are you good at? And not only just good at, that you want to be a part of it, what you want to contribute to the company. So it's really interesting when you take these skill sets or surveys to add these type of strengths to your task, to your daily routines, to your role and responsibility, then people get much more productive, engaged. The third one is simple connectedness, and that's the breadth and depth of our relationships. And the last one, I'll talk more in the next slide. So this is another framework that we talk about in the book, and it's basically the types of happiness that we have. So in the corner there, we have what we call pleasure, or I call rock star happiness. And this is important. Everyone needs their type of pleasures, like, buying a pair of shoes or going out with friends to grab a drink. And this is all important in life, but the unfortunate thing is that it's very fleeting. So basically your happiness level peaks and it comes down really quick. So unfortunately it's very unsustainable, unless maybe if you are a rock star. So the second thing we talk about, type of happiness, is passion and flow. And so flow is actually a term, psychological, where it describes an activity where you do, and it feels like just minutes have gone by, but actually hours have gone by. So if you think about it in your own life, what types of things do you do when you get in that state of flow? And what's great about that is, well, we can apply it to our workplaces now. How can we give ourselves, let's say, 30 minutes a day, 30 minutes a week, whatever it might be, so that we can get in that state of flow? Because all of a sudden, we're much more aligned with what we do, we're more productive, we're more engaged. So this concept, flow, was actually developed by a gentleman. His name was Mikhai Csikszentmihalyi. And rumor had it that he developed the concept because he had to say his name 10 times really fast. So the last kind of happiness we talk about, and this one's the big one, is essentially happiness in higher purpose and meaning. And so this is simple, right? It's like, what can I do that's bigger than myself? But how do you actually get there? So one of the things that I sort of question and kind of challenge people is like, well, I ask people around the world, what is your purpose? And they give me a great answer that I want to be an awesome dad or mom, I want to be a successful entrepreneur for the world. And I'm like, awesome. What else would you add to that purpose statement that only you know that you can add? Because number one, when you're being true to your weird, authentic self. Number two, if you're truly living out your senses of flow and engagement. And number three, what would you add to that purpose statement if you were actually living out those things? So it became this aha moment for us, what this purpose thing is all about. Because if we apply it, back in the day at ZAPPOS, we realized all the studies of positive psychology, it totally parallels and can be applied to a business. So at the end of the day, we all know we need pleasures as individuals, and as companies, we all know we need our profit. But unless we layer on top of that passion and purpose, the odds of us sustaining that happiness for us as individuals or sustaining our companies, the odds would be against us, especially now more in this time and age. So with all this research and experience, maybe some things to ask within your company or within yourself, what might you change a little bit or adapt to because of this thought of prioritizing happiness? So I'm going to switch to my last gear, and I'm going to talk a little bit about delivering happiness and go back to that concept of how do we actually do it. So this is a picture I took in Lake Tahoe, where Tony and I worked on the book back in 2010. And we were really kind of freaked out because we only had 5 weeks to turn in the manuscript, and we hadn't even started it. So we started doing all these motivational techniques, like drinking a lot of coffee. And then we evolved to drinking a lot of vodka. And then we actually drank coffee beans in vodka, which worked really well the first night, but the next morning, terrible idea, I would not recommend it. But we finally got it out, and several months later, we started seeing it popping up in bookshelves, and it was just really cool, very surreal. Landed on bestseller lists, got translated in 20 languages eventually, and this all felt, again, very surreal until things started changing. And things started happening by receiving emails and stories from people that would say, I read this and now I realize I can change my life if I was to prioritize sustainable happiness. Because one of the fundamental things about this is that it's not success that actually drives more happiness, it's actually happiness that drives more success. So when the publisher asked us, hey, what do you guys want to do for your book tour? We're like, not sure, but every single one of these emails was inspiring us to do something about it. And that's why the theme of our tour was inspire and be inspired. So we decided to do this cross country, and we bought this bus. We actually got it from the Dave Matthews Band. You guys, anyone fans, still remember them? Yeah? We actually got it from the bass player, so apparently the band's doing really well. Everyone's got a bus. Very cool. And then we went across country, and we stopped by a lot of places. One of them was Boston Children's Hospital, one of the best in the world. And they sat us down, and they said, you know what? We just formed a culture committee, but we don't understand. Why is it we're clear on our purpose, we want to keep kids healthy, but why are our employees so unhappy? So we said, all right, well, let's think about it for a second. Let's set aside the doctors and nurses for one moment. Who in this company, organization, are the most important people? It's your frontliners. It's the people at the reception desk, because they're basically your first point of contact with your customer, with your patient. What if you were to empower them and say, look, this is all you. You own this experience for this patient coming in. What else would they do differently? So I told that story in New York about a year ago, and someone came up to me afterwards, and he said, I know exactly what you mean. I love going to my doctor's office. And I said, who loves going to their doctor's office? And he's like, no, every time I go to the receptionist, we have this great conversation, she's giving me a smile, and last time she gave me her business card, and on the title of her business card said, Director of First Impressions. So that subtle change, and this is a sense of control. She created her own title, and then she felt she can own it every day because she felt that's aligned with her purpose. So anyway, did this whole Q&A session, and then they gave us a tour of the hospital, and we met this girl there on the bottom left, and she was amazing. She had a kidney transplant, but you wouldn't be able to tell it all because she was just so animated, so full of life, and so we're like, gosh, how are we going to inspire her back? So we said, well, why don't we show her pictures from the tour? And so there you see Tony in the middle there. He picks up this iPad, and he starts flipping through pictures, kind of like the ones you've been seeing. And she just looks at it and just gets more and more animated. And we're like, oh my gosh, what is this girl going to say? And she points at it, and she says, oh my gosh, that is so cool. I love your iPad. So I guess Steve Jobs gets that vote of inspiration, but he deserves it. So anyway, we go to another stop, and this is the last story I'll tell about the tour. But anyway, this is a high school in Arizona. And we get an email from the teacher. He says, I love your book, but I can't afford a book per child. So we're like, no worries. So we sent a bunch of books, and then during the tour, we're like, well, why don't we surprise these kids? And so we stopped along the way, pulled up our bus, get out. Lo and behold, they turned the tables on us. They had this amazing mariachi band playing. They had this huge spread of food that the community came out to make for us. And we're just totally floored by their generosity when this is one of the poorest high schools in the state. So a few months later, we get another email, same teacher, and he said, we realized you don't have a Spanish translation of the book. We're going to translate it for you. So he crowdsourced with teachers, students, administrators, and they translated the whole book for us, and they just said, here you go, we don't want anything in return, we just want to say thanks. Again, floored by their generosity, and then, fast forward a few months later again, this time I get an email from a publisher in Spain, and he said, we're interested in distributing all your books in the world, published or translated in Spanish. And we said, well, we have a caveat because we already have that translation. So back and forth, finally come to an agreement so that pretty much this book came out like 3 years ago now, if not 4, that every single book sold in every single Spanish territory around the whole world, a part of those proceeds actually are going back to these kids in Arizona. And it was one of those moments I had never realized that how much they didn't know that by paying happiness forward, how much they would get in return. So there is something real to this, and it's not just about business, it's about life. So that's why I first started as a book, then we did this crazy bus tour across country, and then eventually the world, and we realized there was a tipping point, that no matter where someone was from, whether or not they're religious, whatever their age was, they felt that if they could actually prioritize happiness, that they could actually change their life in a meaningful way. So that's why basically Tony and I decided to form the company. For us, it means scientific sense, according to the data. It means business sense for profitability and sustainability. And in the end, it means just human sense. Because if we can nudge and change the world with happiness, why wouldn't we do that? And over time, we have over 1 million people that we know of that have been impacted by this. And we call it one PCC at a time, one person, company, and community. Some of the pictures I wanted to share of our community. Those are the kids on the bottom right that actually translated the book, which is cool. And then there's a gentleman over here, I don't know if you can see, he's holding his arm like this. So that was the first evidence of a tattoo of Winky on someone. And when I got that picture, I was like, dude, I wouldn't even get a tattoo of Winky. I don't know why you did, but hopefully he stays happy, because that thing won't fade anytime soon. We also do this in communities. So one of our clients is the government Dubai, so it's a super fascinating case study. At the end of the day, I don't know if you've been to Dubai, if you've heard of it. I call it Vegas on steroids. But, I mean, it's a fascinating place. We have, ATM machines with gold bars coming out of it, and it's like, wow. But at the same time, they have a prime minister that's saying happiness is actually the priority of our citizens. That, as governance, is our priority for you, for their citizens. So it's really interesting how this is all, an interesting environment, and how happiness, true meaningful happiness, can come into play. And last, of course, companies, talking to folks in conferences, talking to businesses, and essentially helping them understand how do you get the happiness ROI into your company. Because time and time again, whether you're HBR, whether you're Time Magazine, all the research is going back to show that if you have happier employees, not only will your retention improve because you have less sick leave, you have less turnover, but also your engagement will improve. So people are more profitable in terms of sales, they're more creative, and they're more innovative. At the end of the day, adding to your bottom line of what it is that you're looking for, profitability. So this is the way we want to translate to reframing the way we work. And all these frameworks that I'm about to share comes from all these years of history at ZAPPOS and now DH. And to boil it down in a very simple way, how do you create that culture and sustain it? So what we have on the left-hand side there is the what framework. And essentially at the bottom of that pyramid is your values and behaviors. So define them that are unique to yourself, your own DNA, and define those behaviors that come out of it. The middle layer are the signs of happiness levers that I talked about: connectedness, control, and a sense of progress. And last but not obviously least is the higher purpose. Essentially aligning your whole organization around this pyramid is the what foundation of your core culture. Then, when we ask that question, how do you actually sustain it over time? Because the biggest thing is you could put this up on the wall, but how do you actually live it? And so what we do is help people in an organization figure out to systemically put them in their organizational systems, so that that foundation of culture lives in everything you do, whether it's hiring, whether it's training, whether it's recruiting, whether it's firing, so that in the end of the day, you're not forcing people to live it, it actually is live by it because it's embedded in your systems. So then we got the other framework, which is who, and we call it me, we, community. Me in the middle being most important of all, because we as individuals have the ability, 90% of our perception of happiness and therefore unhappiness comes from our own brain. We have the control to be able to say, yes, I will show up as my best, authentic, weird self. And I will have the freedom to do what I want to do, but I will also know that I'll be accountable for what I'm supposed to do. So that's where we focus on me first and why. And then we go to the we, which is basically your team, your cross-functional dynamics, your company, and last but not least, the community. And that's, of course, your customers, but also your partners and vendors, but also what is your company doing that's making money, or not just making money, but doing for the greater community at large. So that's the who framework, and a big question that comes up a lot now is ROI of happy culture. And so we talk about CLTV, customer lifetime value, so much, but now we have to recognize ELTV, employee lifetime value. So very basically said, these two lines, colors, represent a company that does nothing for culture, and then the blue is a company that does something for culture, no matter what it might be. And this is how you calculate the ROI, because if you pick on that life cycle from recruiting to training to management, and then eventually that employee probably leaves. So pick any of those points in the life cycle, and then you can actually calculate, as an example, if the length of someone being in your company goes from an average of 9 months to 2 years, that is a very hardcore calculation, black and white, as to how much the company is saving and in the end making. So that's the ROI. Here's some examples. I won't go into detail, but I'm happy to offer a copy of this presentation so you can take a look if you're interested in more examples of calculating ROI. So coming back to it all, this equation, happy employees equals happy customers equals more profitable, sustainable businesses. But again, most importantly, we're all in the business of creating meaningful life within ourselves and with the people that we love and with the people that we touch. So I have a few case studies I'll talk about. One of them is a hospital system of 55,000 employees back in New York, and they wanted to be their goal was to be the 90th percentile in patient satisfaction by 2020. So we went through this whole transformation. They have 300 executives, if you can believe it, and so we had actually got the 300 executives aligned on what their true culture is, and they defined 4 specific values, and the acronym for it was CARE, C-A-R-E. And at that point, after that alignment, we were able to help them roll that out to all their employees. And it was so fascinating. And this is a healthcare system, so we know how bureaucratic it is. And from that alone, we saw engagement of employees go from 45% to 85%. And we saw their patient satisfaction scores go to 90%. They were in the 90th percentile of 20% of their locations already in just a short while. I think it was a year and a half. So that for us was an amazing sense of scale of how you can do this for a large organization. Another example I like to talk about is Kampa, and this one is a Turkish company, about 150 employees. And what they did is they came to a boot camp in San Francisco, 3-day boot camp, brought it back home. 10 months later, I get the longest email I've ever read from a CEO. Actually, he was the president. And he was just saying all these things that have happened since then. He had from 40 applicants a month to 400. Because of the culture book that they created. He went from retention and turnover from 43% to 3% in those 10 months. They became the second best place to work in Turkey. And priority-wise, thank you, is that they were able to say they tripled their sales revenue in that 10 months' time. Pretty amazing. But what I love about that story is because we all know politically how tumultuous it is, but they chose to adapt, control what they can, let go what they can't, and still became successful. Tom's Shoes, really quick, they have an amazing story, but their big problem was old schoolers and new schoolers. Old schoolers were saying, these kids have no idea the blood, sweat, and toil that we had to go through to get here. And the new schoolers were saying, these people have no idea how to operate in a more clean, friendly, engaging way. But then, so we said, all right, well, that's the problem. We're biased. Here's the solution, culture. So they launched this whole program of core values and higher purpose, and we got an email from the CPO, Chief People Officer, saying, it actually works. Because no longer are they coming to work and trying to figure out what's wrong and dividing us. They're coming to work because they realize we are aligned and we're going on for the same goal. So I'll just wrap this all up. As I offered earlier, if you want any of these free tools that we offer, if you want a sample of the culture book or a copy of the presentation, or we have this new survey that we are offering for free, if you want to get the pulse of your culture, happy to send you all these links. You can either email me or, again, send a text to this number, 38470, or if you're an old schooler like me, I like email, you can always email me at Jenn, that's Jenn with 2 N's, at deliveringhappiness.com. So to wrap this all up, if I can ask everyone in the room just to imagine. If you can imagine if you were living by your true, authentic, weird self. Then imagine if you were living by your values and your sense of purpose on a day-to-day basis. Then imagine if you were sustaining meaningful, long-term happiness for your life at work and general life. If you imagine all of that, then I ask for one more thing, just to do. And I know that sounds so simple, but we know that if it was so simple, we'd have happy companies, happy people all over the world. We know that's not the case, but we also know it's changing, and I've seen that firsthand. As when I think about the state of where we're at, I think about this quote by a Persian poet. His name is Rumi. And what he said was, when I was clever, I wanted to change the world. But when I got wise, I knew I had to change myself first. And that's why our fundamental belief at DH is, if you change your world, I believe we can actually change the world. Thank you so much for everyone's time. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you.